I was hoping to write that man that, a lot of maybe straight cis women have experienced, which is still waters run deep, or do they? Hello, my name is Ella Ward. My debut novel is The Cicada House through HarperCollins. It is a story of Caitlin, a woman who has a very eventful 40th birthday, because on the day that she turns 40, she comes into a lot of money and her husband leaves her. So it is a magical story, as if Richard Curtis and Dolly Alderton hung out over a couple of stiff drinks and probably watched a few episodes of Sea Change and maybe wrote the Time Traveller's Wife sequel together. So if that doesn't sound completely unhinged to you, then I think that you're my person and this is probably your book. I really like reading and now writing women who are certainly three-dimensional, but also just a bit wonky. So she has to navigate seemingly small things, but they're big to her, which are things like talking to people, being organised and tidy, and basically just generally being a functioning adult. She's managing, but only just, and I think that's probably how most of us feel sometimes. And then she's got some bigger issues. That husband I mentioned, he has walked out, but she's also an orphan and was brought up by her grandparents. And so she's trying to work out, if she's not a wife anymore and she's not a daughter, then who is she? There are lots of different relationships, but I tried to write every relationship as something slightly fresh or new, the way that they exist out in the world. I didn't want any relationship to be completely predictable. So she meets a tall, well, he's grey, he's not dark, but she meets a tall, grey, handsome stranger at the beginning of the book. And I'm not spoiling anything, but he does not end up being the boring romantic interest that maybe someone might think that he is. And I want that thread to come through. So she meets a new girlfriend and they become friends. And then things are a little bit twisted and anxious and they aren't perfect the way that maybe a burgeoning friendship feels like it will be. She meets someone much younger and she feels old, but she also feels young. And that's sometimes my experience in having transgenerational relationships. And so it's like that. I want her to connect with lots of different people, but I wanted it to be really real and a little bit awkward, just the way that I find making new friends and having relationships can be sometimes. There has been the phrase magical realism bandied around, and I think that sometimes that can take you into a place where people feel like they're overwhelmed with cringe and fear. I wouldn't say that this book is entirely magical realism, but it's maybe Ella's version of magical realism, which is really just how I was brought up. So I have a wild and crazy creative mother, and she brought my brother and I up with games and the opportunity to pretend. And we did that all the time. And a lot of it, actually, when I think back, it's just about reframing. So, for instance, we used to play this game where you would open your eyes and you would pretend that you had time traveled into your body from another time. And you would have 5 seconds to work out where you were, what stage of life you were at, and what was going on. And we used to do this all the time because sometimes it would be really funny because you'd be, I don't know, in the middle of the ocean on a boat somewhere and you'd think, imagine if I was 10 years old and I was suddenly in this body. But other times it was sort of really boring or innocuous. And I just grew up with that thinking that was really normal. And it wasn't until I was sort of in my early 20s and I was meeting new people. I moved to England and I was telling them the story and they were looking at me like I was absolutely bonkers. So I think that idea of taking yourself out of where you are now and putting yourself into another slightly more magical, mystical space, whether it's magical realism or just imagination, I think that's fascinating. And I wanted to weave that through the book a little bit. I am a house architecture real estate freak. I think any person that lives in Melbourne has that terrible itch that we like to scratch. We go through sort of open for inspections or we go to auctions. It's such a uniquely Melbourne thing, I think, or Victorian thing. I know that when my in-laws, when they came over from England for the first time, literally the first thing we did, we didn't take them to the Vic Market, we didn't take them to the Penguins, we took them to an auction. And they absolutely loved it, because who doesn't love that theatre of staying there and watching people bid? And so it's that sense of voyeurism that I've grown up with that has made me really love buildings and homes and houses. My grandma has a embroidered bedspread on her bed in her nursing home. She's had it for as long as I remember. And she has sewn a picture of every single house that she's lived in from the year she was born to now. And it's a lot of houses, because my grandfather moved, he worked in oil basically. So there's about 22 houses on there. And I've grown up with this sort of lying on her bed. So homes are really important to me. The homes that I wrote about in the book, whether it's the Cicada House or other structures and buildings, were from my imagination. But of course they were stolen and, like my grandma, sewn from different places. And then same with the actual locations, England, Australia, Arana Bay is made up, but it's based very closely on a little town in the Bellarine Peninsula where I went a lot from being born, really. So, yeah, that was one of the most fun parts, is taking a patchwork and bringing it all together. I love that question, and no one has asked me that question. And maybe lots of male authors get asked how they write women, but I loved writing the men because for that same reason, I grew up a child of divorced parents. I'm surrounded by separation and divorce. Maybe I shouldn't, tell people that, they'll run away from me. But I think that it's such a fascinating dynamic to talk about the leaving and the walking away. And the person who left is not always the baddie, and it's grey. It's not binary. And so I wanted to write a man in Caitlin's soon-to-be ex-husband who we instantly dislike. And I've been surprised by how angry people are with Paul, because I needed to make sure that there was an element in him that was real and honest and true and likeable, even if maybe that didn't come till a little bit later, because no one's perfect, but also no one's evil. When I wrote the hot tradie, David, I am a little sheepish to admit that I really was just writing effectively a mirror. I was hoping to write that man that, a lot of maybe straight cis women have experienced, which is still waters run deep, or do they? But it doesn't matter because if they're gorgeous and they don't say much, then gosh, we can project everything we want onto them. So I may be doing Dave a little bit of a disservice. I did want him to be more than that. But certainly at the beginning, there is something, pretty attractive about a monosyllabic guy in builder's boots. Maybe that's just me. Well, I was told I was going to write a novel by the excellent and wonderful Catherine Milne at HarperCollins. She's the head of fiction there, and she is a superstar in the publishing world. And Catherine and I started talking in, I think it was 2020, 2021. And she said, I think you should write a novel. And I said, well, you don't know what you're talking about, because that's what you should say to the head of fiction at HarperCollins is, no, I'm not going to write a novel and you don't know what you're talking about. So Catherine encouraged me to write my first book, which was a non-fiction memoir, which was a story of my family and all those houses. And it was all about, me getting sick and having cancer and writing letters to my daughter and then moving through that. And throughout that process, Catherine kept saying to me, you are going to write a novel. And I kept saying, no, I couldn't possibly. And then she was right. And so once that book was out into the world and I was missing the process of writing and creating, I started to realise that actually writing a made-up story is a lot easier than taking the stories of generations before you and your own stories and putting them to paper. That is called 27 Letters to My Daughter. And it is a time-travelling story of family and love, where There's no magic and mysticism, but lots of crazy truths. I loved writing this book. I don't know whether it's just this book. I'm having trouble starting a new one, so maybe that was it. Maybe I used up all of the confetti and cannon fodder. I love writing a novel. I found like for the first year of writing, I wasn't working. I work in advertising. And then for the rest of the time I was. And it both moods and methods worked to the point where it was the ultimate, it's like going into a spa. It's like going into going for a facial or having my hair done. It's the most selfish, wonderful, delicious thing that I could have done was lock myself into a room, put my big noise cancelling headphones on so I can't hear my husband or my child, and just make up stories. I really missed that process when it was over. And the editing process I loved. But that is because I do have this background in advertising where, where I'm not going to swear, but we're not very nice people and we have no souls. But we're very good at having very brutal, open, honest conversations when it comes to creativity. It's, it's on the table. Is this going to sell something? Yes, no, move on. Does the client like this? Yes, no, move on. You're constantly having feedback and discussions that can be very brutal, but it's actually about something that's very ephemeral and creative. And so I came into the editing process feeling sort of up for the fight. And I hope that the HarperCollins team really enjoyed that because I was not afraid to kill my darlings, as they say. It was a bit of a slaughterhouse and I enjoyed it. My husband and then my mother, and both of them have very different ways of providing feedback, but are incredibly supportive and much too positive and much too optimistic. And so I think it was my agent, Pippa, and then Catherine, who read the next iteration. And that was a lot more fulfilling for me because I felt like I was getting honest feedback. It's a real cop-out, Kate, but I like reading everything. But what I enjoy is bouncing from nonfiction to fiction. I find that I really rarely read one novel after the other. It's almost like a constant palate cleanser. So I'm currently in the middle of Erotic Vagrancy, the new Burton Taylor, just unbelievable story told in the most extraordinary way. And that is sometimes feels fantastical when it is nonfiction. But I know that after that, and also prior to that, I really like diving into something completely fanciful. So I will often move from fantasy to Anne Patchett and then back to Maggie Alderson. And I just love anything that is a complete difference, but also the experience that I enjoy the most is seeing threads and similarities where you wouldn't expect it. So prior to Erotic Vagrancy, I did finish the most recent Maggie Alderson book, which is fantastic. And I love the fact that they sort of mention English and Wales and that stays there. And then suddenly I'm in Wales with Richard Burton and his family. So yeah, I'm a bit of a magpie when it comes to reading. I was asked this question by my boss. And I said to him, I think that this is a loaded question because you're basically trying to work out whether I'm going to keep working with you or not. And the answer is yes, of course. But I am struggling because I've had this idea for about a year now, and it's all about a woman who is perfect. And she's almost like a Pollyanna. And then she does something really bad. And it has to be quite public because she has to be shamed. And it's the idea of, can you come back from that? But where I'm struggling is how bad can I make it and still make her a likable character? And that's the line I'm walking at the moment. So we'll see. Thank you so much for having me, Kate. Excellent questions and good lighting.